Hello and welcome to Grouchy Geeks episode 39. My name's Steve, my co-host is Scott.
Hello.
This episode we have a very special guest. It's Dan Marshall, former sidekick.
What's up?
So, for this special episode, we're not doing any news because we've got too much to talk about. I told Scott about a recent comic that he should try, and he's now read it, and we brought Dan in to talk about it as well because he's a fan of it too. And this is...
I love it.
Yeah? Well, it's just spoiled what he thinks of it already. But
this was the week.
What a great moment it would be if you'd made the effort to come on, just to have a go at it for
this
an hour.
book, and these are the reasons why for an hour.
My quick capsule review, and I am out.
Yes, we love this. We all love this book. But this is Mr. Miracle by Tom King and Mitch Gerards, and this is a 12-issue series, and they won the Eisner for Best Writer and the Eisner for Best Artist. I think it was 2017, or 2018. So fantastic book that we're going to talk about. And Scott had not read this before, and I've reread it recently.
Not only did I not read it, I've not heard of it. So I went in literally knowing nothing about it other than your recommendation.
Did you know anything about the characters beforehand?
No.
Do you think that mattered, though, as well?
I was familiar with Darkseid,
yeah,
but not only in the sense that I knew the name. That was about it.
Yeah.
So you had read comic books before then?
Yeah, well, occasionally. I'm not a big fan.
13 years into comic book podcast, yeah. This is what he tells me.
What?
Do you think it mattered that you didn't know who the characters were and you didn't have a rich history of their DC background before reading this?
I think it possibly did, because one of the things that they're very clearly doing in the comic, and we'll get into this in more detail later, I'm sure, is that they're clearly sort of playing with the characters and playing with the whole concept of reality, and to some extent, the format and general narrative of a comic book. So I think actually going in completely cold and not knowing the backstory when the story itself begins with one of the characters has attempted suicide.
Yeah.
Spoiler.
We're going to spoil this to pieces, so don't worry. If you've not read it, he's going to spoil it.
That I kind of felt like I was missing out, but I also because I'm not familiar with what went before, I don't know to the extent that they've completely reinvented the characters. I'm guessing that they have done quite a lot. So, you tell me, how much am I missing out by not knowing anything about what went before?
Well, if I can jump in, I'm kind of in the middle. So I knew I knew who Mr. Miracle was, because I think, didn't they recently do not this series, but didn't they bring him back in fairly recently into one of the DC books?
I'm not sure if they did,
because I'd seen him in passing in something, and I knew Jack Kirby created him.
Yeah,
I knew the name New Gods. I kind of knew who Darkseid was. No one else I knew, though. I mean, I only recognised Mr. Miracle from his suit. So I think there are certainly some things that they play on from the past. I think the Kirby stuff particularly, and we'll get into that a little bit later on. I think there's enough there that pays homage to it. But I think, well, I felt anyway, coming into it fresh, what I really liked about it was what they allude to without paying too much fan service. It wasn't laden with wink wink nudge nudge, if you've read this you'll get more out of it. They do enough in here where they're we're going to get you up to speed, but really the book's about him. We're not really going to cover the history and stuff. I think they did really well there. Yeah,
it's that thing of if you read Watchmen and you were familiar with some of the characters from before, from the Charlton days, or you are familiar with who they're kind of copies of from DC, you get a little bit more, but not too much. You can still kind of read Watchmen and go, okay, that was really good, and I enjoyed it. I think I felt Mr. Miracle is kind of the same, because you have that issue 0 in the front almost that says, this is who he is, this is where he came from, this is what happened, right, and now here's the story. And I think coming in cold, that's probably enough. You get a bit more if you're a fan like me who's aware of the New Gods and Fourth World stuff, but I don't think it matters too much. But obviously it didn't spoil your enjoyment of the book, I'm sure, Scott.
At all.
No, I mean, and it was, they did it really well, because I was reading it and I was definitely aware as I was reading it that there's subtleties here there's subtleties or references that I'm missing out on.
Yeah.
But the story doesn't depend upon those things. So I was like, as somebody that knows all about the character will be getting more out of this. But it's not something that you're gonna. It doesn't ruin the story by you missing out on some of those things that they're alluding to.
Yeah, I think that's fair. That's fair.
Did you guys read Vision?
Sorry, say that again.
Did you guys read Vision by Tom King?
No, I haven't.
The Visions.
I have.
So it's similar in that you don't necessarily have to have known all the history of Vision, because really he's not. I think it would do a disservice to say that he's a cipher, but because it's about, without sounding pretentious, kind of the human condition, he's just the lens through which you're looking at these things, as opposed to you have to kind of understand the character and his history in order to get kind of any. I think all the important stuff, which is the layering in Mr. Miracle and the same in Vision, that is just really good storytelling, and they are just how you're looking at this stuff, as opposed to being laden and having to kind of pay all this stuff to like the history.
But as we sort of already started talking about it, and it's really interesting. But Steve, would you mind just sort of kind of setting the scene for us and
Steve,
telling us a little bit about? I noticed the slopey shoulders here. This is a good good business technique. So perhaps you can just sort of set the scene and tell us who the character is and just where we are at the beginning of it.
Yeah. So Kirby created him when he came back to DC, having gone to Marvel, I think, and then he came back again and started. He wanted to do a bunch of stuff at Marvel. I don't think they'd let him, so he came back and did it at DC instead, and did his own pocket universe with the Fourth World and the New Gods and all of this. And so there's parallels between this and stuff in the Bible in a way, because you have Mr. Miracle, whose name is Scott Free, but that's not his actual name. We don't know what his real name is. And it parallels God and the devil in a way, because you have Highfather, who's the ruler of this fantastic world, who's all love and peace and God and joy, and then you have Darkseid, who's the ruler of this horrible world called Apocalypse, and they have a massive war for, I think it's hundreds of years, and they finally come to a sort of peace because they exchange sons, and Darkseid gives up his son, who becomes Scott Free, who's raised on Apocalypse and tortured every day, and his son, Darkseid's son, Orion, who's a bit of a knobhead, goes to live on the peaceful world, and he's surrounded by joy and love and intelligent people and nice conversation.
He's a total knobhead as well.
And he is a knobhead. And the book picks up where they're all now adults, and Darkseid, who is basically evil personified, is attempting to crack this code for the anti-life equation. And basically, if he does that, he'll be able to unravel reality and destroy his enemies and everybody, because it's not quite he can snap his fingers, but he can unmake things, is what the kind of how they phrase it, I think.
Now, I always thought the anti-life, and I'm not steeped in DC stuff, I'm only like recently getting into that. I thought the anti-life equation was more you can control people. Is that not?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. Yeah. I think it's moving. I think it's moving the furniture without you seeing, so you can change things.
Okay.
Because part of the thing in this book is Scott isn't sure if he's been infected with it, because he's not sure if he's going mad or not, and then he's sort of kind of characters are trying to work out if he is, and the reader has to decide for themselves if what he did at the beginning was partly because Darkseid was to blame, or wasn't he? So there's this ambiguity in this book in lots of places, but that's the first thing on the first page. Scott Free's tried to kill himself, slit his own wrists, and you don't really find out. Well, you find one of the reasons why, but not all of them, I think.
Yeah.
Is that fair enough summary, Scott, of where we start?
Brilliant, fantastic, top of the class, A star.
Ah, brilliant, brilliant. So, where do we go next then? Because there's a lot in there.
I think, is it a couple of ground rules first? Are we allowed to cuss?
Yeah, you can swear.
Okay, we can swear. Okay. I'm not going to open with that. I just want to check.
To be fair with you, Dan,
be fair.
If swearing was a problem, we wouldn't have invited you on in the first place.
True.
That
True
is
story,
motherfucking fair. Okay. Do you know what I love about this book? Just to kind of open it up, you mentioned about like the layers in this, and with the vision before. I love that it's kind of the book is written to kind of embrace the idea that the reader can interpret any way they want, no matter what's going on or the themes or the end, everything that happens in it. It's kind of up to you, and you can reread it with one thing in mind and just follow those. Have you seen Birdman with Michael Keaton?
Yes.
Yeah.
So you can do that with that movie. Every time you watch it, you can watch it where you're just following kind of one, not necessarily decision, but whatever layer you want to believe it to be, and watch it through that prism. You can kind of do that with Mr. Miracle.
Yeah. You could just say it's a book about a war, and that's all it's about. When that is one of the layers, and it's about the war and God and Highfather and Darkseid and all the rest of it. But then there's everything else that's going on.
And
it's really, I think that's one of the really clever things about it, that you're reading something where his perception of reality is clearly skewed, and becomes more and more skewed as it goes on, and you're watching this character go through this, but at the same time, it's written in such a way where it's messing with the reader's perception of the reality of the comic as well.
Yeah.
Like it breaks the fourth wall multiple times, including you have the Darkseid is panels, and then you have Darkseid referring to the panels at one point, and then you've got panels that are being sort of glitched and distorted and breaking out of the 9 panels and stuff like that. So I really liked the way that
it plays with it.
It was kind of like making you feel the same sense of unease that he was feeling in some way.
Yeah, and at one point, instead of saying Darkseid it's just the same picture of Darkseid.
Yeah. And the 9-panel grid, I think, is fantastic. It works as like a brilliant structure.
It's amazing.
It's rarely broken, only on like a couple of occasions. And when it does, you notice it because you've got used to that rhythm and structure. So when it breaks, you go, wait, what? And it just kind of catches you. Like there are all these beats on a page, and then as you go through each issue, and it's just fantastic.
Yeah, and it kind of eases you into that, doesn't it? Because it's not like you get the big splash page of what's happened, and you kind of don't realise that that's the structure of it. And I thought, actually, Steve, that's why I thought you mentioned kind of Watchmen earlier, because it reminded me of that. I know they play with it a bit more in Watchmen, but they definitely do. Sometimes they're just like, right, we're going to give you the beats. It's important. You're following the narrative. We're not going to try and be too clever with it. But it also, I think, without sounding kind of pompous, I think it speaks about like how he's trying to keep everything in control with everything else that's going on.
Yeah. Because the whole thing at the beginning is he's lost control. Something's not right, despite the world apparently going how he wants it to, but something's still wrong with him, and he can't work out what it is. And it's that thing of control. He can control his life up to a point. He can control his job because he's an escapologist. That's what he does. He plans everything. He escapes. But something's rotten inside, and he can't escape that, and that's what's bothering him all the time.
Yeah,
and I think that's expressed really well through the panels, because you've got this. So it's interesting that this sort of traditional 9-panel format is one of the reasons for doing it is you can cram loads and loads of stories if you've got 9 panels on a page.
Oh yeah.
But they have 9 panels on a page, and then like really decompress it at the same time, which sort of gives it this kind of claustrophobic feel, and there's times when they have one image going over several panels, and it's made to look like prison bars, and they really the way that it does this fourth wall breaking, and it plays around with the format of comics. I don't remember seeing somebody do it that effectively before.
No, they're definitely trying to push it in like how they're communicating it visually.
Yeah.
But like without going to the extremes, without being like, oh, hey, listen, we're trying to do something different here. Because despite kind of trying to change things up and the visual language, it's still just a comic. It's about Mr. Miracle, and it's about the story they're telling us with that, rather than them showboating.
Absolutely, yeah. Never once do you get the impression that they're going, hey, look how clever we are.
Yeah, because I used to. So I initially read this on Comixology. I've got the trade as well now, but I usually use guided view on Comixology. Do you guys use that ever?
I hate it.
Oh, okay.
I use it.
Moving quickly over, what I was going to say was actually, with Mr. Miracle, I didn't use the guided view because it was, for me, after I got a couple of pages in, I was like, you're supposed to read this looking at all nine.
Yes.
Because it feels like it is the very definition of sequential art. Because quite often the one page is telling that's one beat.
Yeah.
And then you get the next bit, and that's a kind of an important bit. You need to kind of read it as a whole. And I pied off the guided view. It's not how it's supposed to be read.
It doesn't work as well, especially for this book. When you get to certain images, like there's a one shot of Darkseid where he's sat in a throne and he breaks the panel. He's like in the middle, and his arms in one panel and his arms in another one. And then it's mirrored where earlier Scott's on the bed and like the Christ-like pose. And you can't do that panel to panel. You need to see him spread eagled and tied up on the bed and all that kind of stuff. And I just don't see how it would work doing it one at a time.
Yeah, which is why I got shot of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Wise decision, I think.
Thanks.
Because I'm some kind of expert, clearly.
Yeah. Do you guys know where that? So I did, because I know you two were like proper clever. I wrote notes and everything, and I went on the interweb as well, just in case, because I was not knowing anything, which you touched on earlier. I was like, is this Darkseid is thing? Is that like a mantra or something that he makes people say as part of the army? So I looked. Do you guys know where it comes from?
No, I didn't.
It's something to do with philosophy, I think.
Well, it's actually, apparently, so in Grant Morrison's run of JLA, the Rock of Ages one, there's a bit where it goes into, because they basically don't save the world, so it goes into the future that's broken, where he's taken over, and there's all these posters in the background that say Darkseid is. So there's like these propaganda posters in the background, and it says Darkseid is. And Tom King, I can't remember who it was, but he was at a con, and he was talking about how like a certain part of it was like quite dark, and this guy just kept saying like Darkseid is, and he's like, what's that? So he explains it to him, and he's like, that is a brilliant way of kind of using as a beat kind of the things the thing inside you that you can't control, that dark thing, or that thing that you can't kind of keep control of, that's always trying to kind of bubble up under the surface. So that's where like those beats come from, and it's quite interesting, I think. So I found that out after I'd done the second reading before we're recording now. And it's quite interesting, actually, knowing that and just flicking through the book, because at the start of the book, where obviously things are falling apart a lot more and everything's going wrong, the Darkseid is beats happen more and more. Like there's obviously the obvious parts where, like when Orion's beating him and he's really trying to keep it under until it's actually the first time you see him like lash out and kind of properly stick up for himself, and you see that Darkseid is quite often. And then towards the end, it's more about kind of the discomfort, or when like Barda challenges him for the first time. I think it's later on, maybe like 9 or 10 issues in, and it just pops up the once, because it's him just kind of like, how it's the first time we're dealing this, how do I do that, as opposed to be something like super ominous and dark, which I think is kind of like just as humans and we interact, that's how we're all trying to like, you know, I suppose if interactions are kind of like dances, sometimes we miss those steps, you know, in our interactions, where you could have handled it better. And that kind of, that Darkseid is that bit where he's like, not reflecting, because obviously it means a bit more than that, but that thing where it kind of is bubbling up and he's like, ah, shit, yeah, I've messed that bit up.
Yeah, and I like so two things to say there. First of all, I like the fact that you felt you tried to need to keep up with us, and in doing so, you overshot so massively.
I've actually got a professor on the other line, and he's telling me what to say. I paid him to read the book and then just tell me.
Brilliant. We'll talk about Kant in a minute because that's in the book.
But yeah, so especially in the first issue, I really like the way that they did the Dark Side is panels again in this 9-panel structure, which you would normally use to cram in loads of story. They then kind of gave you these beats in these Dark Side is panels that just became, it took up more and more panels on each page until it just took up an entire page, which is one of the very few times it breaks that 9-panel structure and just has a single page image. And the other thing that reminded me of the Dark Side is panels. There's lots and lots of discussions about going back to what you were saying, Steve, about there are sort of biblical parallels in some of the stuff that's going on. There's lots of discussions all the way through the story about the face of God and knowing what the face of God looks like, and that sort of gets brought to a conclusion, towards the end of the comic book. But it's these things that keep coming back that you could almost, you can't miss them because they happen all the time and they're very prominent. But it's the subtlety with which they do some of these things, where they're sort of conveying something to you without necessarily knowing the direction that they're leading you in.
Yeah, well, I actually think they're telling you everything early on, but you don't know how to put it all together. Just like going back to like the dark that you just mentioned about the face of God thing, like the story that keeps popping up, and then at the end, it's probably the first time. It's not the very end, so we're not skipping too far. But at one point, when you see Scott, probably at his most peaceful through the whole thing, and they say, "Oh, what's it like?" And he's like, "It's like looking at the face of God."
Yeah,
and it comes back. So you see that's like one of the. I'm pretty sure you see him, if memory serves. You see him obviously cut his wrists, and the very next thing is that story with the kid before you get to the hospital.
Yeah, I think so.
So like early on, it's telling you those things. The one thing it does really well, or at least it might be that I've misinterpreted it, and I hope that I haven't, because I love the idea where you think that his initial kind of suicide attempt is him trying to escape death, and it's not until Barda kind of confronts him later on you realise he was trying to escape life.
Yeah,
which is equally as both like as dark and as kind of victorious towards the end. But again, it's that thing where they're kind of telling you everything you need to know at the start. You just don't realise that they're telling you yet, because it's early doors and there's so much context kind of by repetition that by the time you've got there, you're like, oh, yes. And that kind of makes you want to read it again.
Because so they start with the suicide, and you think at first it's just because he's upset, but you get kind of the middle point, and you hear stuff about the anti-life equation, and at this point people have been turning up and talking to him who aren't there. You've had the stuff where he's thought Barda's eyes are different colour. He's had the stuff with Oberon. There's all these moments where you go, oh, blatantly, that's why he cut his wrists. And then you get further on, you go, no, he actually told you early on that isn't why. And Barda accuses him of, trying to escape his life, and he's not happy when everything's going right, and yet he's still not happy. So there's something wrong with him. So he looks outside of himself to find something to blame, and looks for the anti-life equation and says, you've done this, and he even blames his brother, who's not really his brother, saying, it's you're the traitor, you've done this, and all this kind of stuff, where it's all about looking inside and trying to work out and solve your own stuff and sort yourself out before projecting it. It's tidy your room and look after your own needs before trying to solve those of other people.
Yeah. I think, like, in terms of all the layering and the stuff that they tell you that you don't realise, I think that's encapsulated in the story. I don't know his name, the guy that says, it turns out to be a lie, but he says he spent all this time with Leonardo da Vinci in Renaissance Italy. And he tells the story. Yeah, and he tells the story about the two painters, and one's grapes, and they're like, what's great about grapes? You know, it's just a painting that you painted grapes, and then a bird comes down and tries to eat them, and everyone loses their minds. They think it's the best thing ever, because if you can fool a bird into thinking it's food, it must be the best thing ever. And then they say to the master, right, you're going to raise the curtain, and he goes, what curtain? And I think that's the perfect metaphor for this book. Well, you could read it as, you know, straight up new gods with maybe like a quirky take on it being like mixed with like real life, you know, them having kids, them trying to hold stuff down, that thing of like you might be different in the workplace to who you are at home, to your loved ones and stuff. But there's actually so much more. It's not the grapes, it's definitely the curtain.
Well, that story to me is probably the most important thing of the entire comic, because it's one of those things. So when I as I was reading through it, there was that story about the two artists, and I thought, and it was like, clearly this is super important, but the payoff of it is only in the final issue, where it actually starts to talk much more openly about, is what he's experiencing real, and if what he's experiencing isn't real, does it really matter to him? You know, and he kind of makes this choice, or at least my interpretation of it is, he kind of makes this choice about, okay, things might not be real, but I'm happy with them as they are, so I'll just choose to carry on believing it. And to me, that was the bit about the book that most excited me. It was that story about the two artists, and then the payoff that you get from that, when, although they don't refer back to it, they're sort of openly discussing those ideas in the very last issue.
Yeah. I've got to say that we've been doing this podcast how many years? Like 13 years? Something like that?
Something like that.
I never thought in all that time I'd start talking about Kant, the philosopher, on this podcast. Because earlier, referring to what you just said, earlier it's even before you get to the story of the artist, he talks about Kant's perception of, you know, I think, therefore I am. Then he kind of goes around and...
So I'll feel guilty for this, but I think, therefore I am is René Descartes, not Kant.
So which one is... So this is about...
You're talking about with the explanation of that into like the God, isn't there? So if God exists and God is good, then this exists.
Yeah.
The better version of it.
I think, therefore I am, God exists, and the world exists. Oh, he says like Kant came later on. Sorry, you're right. He says Descartes, and then it's Kant later on who starts talking about it doesn't work, because if you say that, it's a circular thing, it's a tautology, and they go around. But I think that's kind of pointing to what you've just said there, where he has to decide what he thinks is reality and accept it on one level or not accept it. So later on, when one of the other people talks and turns up and says, we can't trust Orion, he's killing all these people, but we'll follow you. It's like Scott just talks to him as if he's there, but I don't think he is there at all. But he's decided just to accept, if this is what reality is, I'll go with it. And even at the very end, when fucking Highfather turns up, he's not really there, but he punches Highfather. So it's like that Fight Club thing of he's punching himself from an outsider's viewpoint, but to Scott, it's perfectly real.
But who's to say he's not? Because here's the kicker, is actually, who's to say whether those are or not?
Well, yes, is you.
So when you talk about like Scott gets to choose, and so do you.
Yes.
Which is why I think it's so good. So when you go back, pick what you can read it like a guy crumbling, completely losing touch with reality, and just like moments of clarity in him kind of holding on. You can read it as someone messing with him. There's enough there in all the bits. I think even like in... So I can't remember the name. Is it Oberon? Scott is the guy that is messing with his gloves at the start. It's supposed to be Jack Kirby, right?
Kind of, but Oberon's been around for donkeys as well. He's like his friend and helper.
Right, because I think like he looks like Wolverine crossed with Jack Kirby to me, and he's got the cigar.
Always got the cigar,
And he also says the thing about like comics will break your heart.
Yeah.
Which is a Jack Kirby line, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And then at the end, he pops back up and he says, "Kid, this, all this, it'll break your heart."
Yeah.
Which kind of speaks to that stuff of like they're going to keep not the canonical stuff, but like they it's as much like a love letter to whatever it was like Kirby was trying to do, because the other choice you can make is actually, is this in continuity or not? Is this a standalone book, or is it in keeping with that? And they're all, I think, they're things that they kind of, and the whole book doesn't hinge on any of these ideas. And it's really hard to kind of keep all those things together and still pull it off.
Mm. But that's, I mean, and again, going back to sort of the narrative genius of it, it's so clever the way that it puts, you know, again, very subtly, without showing off about how clever it is, it puts you in the same predicament as him. That it kind of gives the message of reality is kind of a choice.
Yes.
Yeah.
That it messes around with your perception of things, and it plays with the narrative and it breaks the fourth wall, and there's sufficient ambiguity there that you can kind of get to the end of it and be like, okay, I'm sort of choosing to believe this is what the story is about, and that's exactly what he does himself at the end.
Yeah,
it's like he doesn't know what's real, and you know it's possible that he actually successfully committed suicide, and is in hell, or it's possible that he's a victim of the anti-life equation, or it's possible that this is reality. It's like none of those possibilities matter. I'm just going to choose to go with this interpretation of what happened, and that's what it gets you to do, without again being pompous about it, which it so easily could have fallen into.
Because what's the probably the most inconsequential character, the clerk? You know, when he's getting the stuff for the birthday party.
Oh yeah,
and he's talking to the clerk.
Yeah.
And at that point, he's labouring over whether or not to give Jake the baby up to Darkseid, and the clerk says to him like something along the lines of like whatever keeps the most people happy. And it's inconsequential. I think it's like half a page tops, that kind of that piece. But that's what he does at the end. Like the ending he kind of picks, or the perception he kind of picks for himself, is the one that probably keeps the most people happy.
Yeah.
Scott, you mentioned about the people that he's visited by. I think there's some that are kind of deliberately presented for you to be like, that's not real. And like when Granny turns up, obviously then she's died at that point. That's probably the most obvious example. But kind of the other ones, that guy that you mentioned, that's like, is he like leader of the insect army?
Yeah, he's
like the bugs. Yeah, he was probably the only one up until the moment that you mentioned it that I didn't question. Because is it Light Ray?
Yeah, Light Ray turns up and zaps him, and you think Finks has done that and booms out again.
But it is just after he's taken the paranoid pills.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that kind of like I didn't put two and two together at that point, but now you've mentioned it, I was like, they hoodwinked me there.
Yeah, a lot of this book is open to perception. You just decide. There are certain events that are fixed and are rigid, and you can see what's going on, and you know the story and the war and the family and all that kind of stuff. But a lot of it is just like you decide what's real and what's not, and so does Scott, as you said.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things, again, something else that I thought was really brilliantly done was the way that he just kind of drifts through the story. In that his idea of reality is clearly unhinging, and he's clearly, at least again, I guess there's an interpretation there, but to me, it clearly seems very, very depressed. And it's interesting how, there's the story where they're discussing the fact that they're about to execute him, and he's having his last day before he gets executed.
Yeah,
and the birth of his child, and fighting in this terrible war. There's all of these things happening, where he kind of is unreactive through all of it. Which I thought was really, he doesn't experience these highs or lows, or, they're discussing executing him, and he's not getting angry. And it's clearly a kangaroo court where, there's only ever going to be one answer. But he just accepts it, and he doesn't he doesn't fight it, and he almost kind of plays into it as well. And it reminds me of, I don't know if either of you read The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, which is a book about a woman suffering from depression.
Scott, Sylvia Plath is my jam.
Really?
No.
You had me going as well there. I was like, wow, you Sylvia Plath.
I'm going to get the professor to read it, and then we'll do a podcast about it.
So Sylvia Plath was a woman that suffered from terrible depression. She was married to, in the 60s, the British poet laureate, even though she's an American woman. And she wrote a story about a woman suffering from depression called The Bell Jar. And a relatively short time after writing it, she killed herself. And The Bell Jar is a book about depression, and also her diaries came out, which is a very, very interesting sort of dissection of somebody that's suffering from terrible depression. I've got the book and I've got a copy of her diaries as well. But the metaphor of the bell jar is this about she's going through life and all of these awful things are happening to her. But because she's so depressed, she's not kind of reacting to all of these things. And she's sort of, she gets almost raped in it, and all of these other awful things happen. But she just kind of drifts through it without ever getting, really angry about things or having a terrible reaction to them, because she's just so consumed by a whole depression. And it's a brilliantly written book, and the diaries are fascinating. But the way that Scott is represented in the comic reminds me of the bell jar, because he's just so accepting of everything. Like he's doing all of this heroic stuff and saving people and fighting in this epic battle and facing his own execution and having a child and raising a child, but none of it, he just sort of seems to drift through it without really having much of a reaction to anything. And I thought that was a really good depiction of somebody that is depressed and directionless and doesn't know where they're going. That I spent a really long time on that. More time than I should have done.
So the only times he loses it is when it concerns other people. So when they're negotiating for the war and they're talking over the table about saving lives and stuff, he loses it at that point and starts shouting. And the only other time I can remember, there's probably something else, is that when Orion is basically doing the kangaroo court and he's the judge and jury, and he starts saying, oh, so you're this, and therefore you think this, and therefore you're made of hate. And he goes, yes. And then he snaps and punches Orion. And Orion goes, Jesus, because up to that point he's been so placid. And he absolutely loses it and knocks Orion's helmet off. And Orion's just freaked out because they've not seen him get that agitated before. But yes, you're right. The rest of the time, he's just... He fights in the war. He goes along with it. They put him on trial. He says, "Yeah, fine. Yeah, that's fine."
But if you think about it, we all kind of do that. You know what I mean? You just like on the day to day, like the trials and tribulations day to day, the stuff you've got at work, just like the troubles that you've got, trying to make sense of stuff. The best way of kind of approaching all different situations. Sometimes you just have to go in. And sometimes the least stressful way of doing that is just presenting the honest version of yourself. And I think for Scott, I'm not saying for a minute that he isn't depressed, but I think for Scott, he's just like, I'm not going to pretend in front of Barda or in certain situations that I've got all this figured out. And it's funny, in the war stuff, like he knows how to do all that. He was kind of bred for that, in the pits with Granny and all that stuff. And he kind of knows what he needs to do when they're doing those negotiations. But the rest of it, and I think we all feel like this, like no one's really got it all figured out. I think with Scott, his thing is like, I'm not going to pretend that I have. I'm just going to be like, because there's a few moments in this where I really identified with it, where he's kind of like, I don't really have an opinion on that. I'm happy for you to tell me whatever it is I need to do. And like with the count, go on.
No, I was going to say, I really want a Barda. I think everyone should have a Barda in their life, basically, because at one point where he's just sort of saying, I'll go along, and she goes, no. And then she changes her mind and just beats the shit out of the guys who've come and kills them, who've come to take him away. And she goes, stay. He's like, I want someone in my life like that.
Yeah. Well, Barda is based on Kirby's wife.
Yes, Roz Kirby. Yeah. And
Roz,
their
that's it.
relationship.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, but
fantastic.
go on.
But one of the things that one of the things about sort of how epic and trivial his life is that I really loved and I thought was such a tiny thing, but was so clever that, there's this trial for his execution, and it's just happening in a living room, and he was worrying about getting dip for
the veggie tray.
Veggie tray.
And the veggie tray is like, I loved it because it was
brilliant.
Just the juxtaposition of the tray, and there are several panels of you see your hand picking up like a carrot and dipping it in and eating it, and this is about his execution, and that was what his concern was, and it's just stuff like that just puts it in a different league to almost anything else I've ever read.
Yeah, I think for me that's just as much about those tropes, but also about like how when you don't know, when there's things that are completely beyond your control, there'll be one thing and you're like, right, do you know, if I sort that out, some semblance of order, then in my mind, at least a little bit of it is okay. And that thing about the veggie tray, like he's so resigned to it. They're like, where do you want to do it? And he's like, I'll just come here. I'm going to get a veggie tray. Because he's literally got nothing else.
No, that's it. Yeah. I think one of the funniest moments in this whole comic is that you have Darkseid, who's the ultimate evil, and he's there eating out the veggie tray.
That is brilliant. And as well, do you know how they use, so at one point he's out on the piss with Booster Gold, and he uses the mother box to boombox home like he's phoning an Uber.
Yeah.
But it still manages some really tender moments as well. Like there's the bit, it's kind of after or in the middle of all the warring stuff, and it's the first time they're in LA driving, and he's saying to her, would it be nice if we got a song? And she's like, no, because we should have a song. That'd be nice, a song that we shared back. And she's like, all we had were like the horrible screams of like the pits. And he's like, oh, okay. So he goes on the mother box and he's like, oh, can you play screams? And the mother asks, what screams? And he's like, just the ones from the pits circa like 1984 or whatever. And then it just plays these horrific screams. And he's pleased as punch.
Yeah.
But it's a really tender moment between the two of them.
Yeah. It's just, there's some things in this book that are just grotesque if you think about them too much. Like, in Star Trek, you've got the blood wine, which is horrible, that the Klingons drink all the time. In this, you've got bone wine, which is made from dead gods. And the fact that it's like Barda's, delicious, and she used to brew it.
I'll tell you what, there's one thing. So, this is, you may or may not agree with me on this at all, and maybe it's just that I was particularly triggered by it, but there's a scene where they go and negotiate with is it Granny or Nanny? I've forgotten. Granny. And they're negotiating with it, and she brings out a meal, and she'd captured one of her enemies.
Yeah.
And she was like, to punish him, I'm starving him to death. But it amuses me to have him around to watch other people eating.
Yes.
And that stuck with me for days. Like, it was seriously just the casual cruelty of doing that.
Yeah.
It's so weird. And I almost felt like it was kind of being played for laughs, but I took it really seriously. Mm-hmm. But it was just, it absolutely, it seriously freaked me out. And I can't remember the last time I watched or read something that disturbed me to that level. Just the cruelty of it. It was, for some reason, I just really took it to heart.
Are you okay now?
Well, now that I've talked through it with you, I feel a lot better.
there's another.
But maybe I'm overreacting, but do you know what I mean? That it was just something.
I know exactly what you mean. I think I didn't have the same reaction to it. I think hearing you talk about it makes me think, like, am I a bit of a sociopath? Because all I took that out, like, that's something that informs that character. But I think more because all the whole time I'm reading it, I'm trying to pick up the threads from the history of New Gods and stuff. But on that, like how that casual stuff it pulls off like effortlessly. It's kind of like when they break in on Apocalypse. And all they're talking about that they're killing people and like escaping these like huge sea creatures, and all they're talking about is creating space in the condo.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's done without, again, it's that effortless thing where they do it where you're not like, oh, isn't it clever that they're doing this? It's done so well that you're loving the juxtaposition of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in the hands of lots of other people that had a similarly clever idea, it would be pretentious, but it never ever comes across like that. And that's kind of the genius of it, that it's doing something really clever. But they're not broadcasting, hey, look how clever we are for doing this.
So the thing is, we said that Scott was raised on Apocalypse and he's gone through hell and he's trying to appear tough all the time, but there's the moment where he's negotiating with Kalibak, who's Darkseid's son. They're trying to find peace. And it gets to one point where basically they start arguing and Kalibak loses his shit. And then there's that moment where you realise they've been negotiating for, days at this point. And the table's being propped up by prisoners in chains.
Yeah, I found.
Yeah, and he grabs one of them and just smashes him into the wall. And it's going, and then Kiss kind of says, I found the page, because he goes, when will you learn? I'm not some new Genesis toddler. I'm not Orion. I was raised by Granny. He goes, and I do not waste time on the dead. And you're like, oh.
Yeah.
That got me as well, Scott, like the moment with Granny, because it's like, you could try and mourn for that guy. It's no point. He's dead. We're trying to save billions of life, and you expect me to get upset that one guy who's been propping up the table for the last 5 days has just been executed in front of me because she had a temper tantrum. But Scott's hard enough to kind of say, look, no, that doesn't bother me. But later on when he's in bed with Bardo, he starts shaking, and you can see that some of it was just bluff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I felt with that, like, that it was really affecting that bit. But even more so because before that, it's kind of, for me anyway, it's speaking to like the absurdity of sometimes some of the meetings you have in your working life, where at that point in time, winning that argument is probably the most important thing that you can think of. But it's absurd. Like when, I can't remember if it's Scott now, or the other guy, when he says bringing in the Sunsword Commission report is preposterous. And you're like, and then that stuff, it kicks off, and then he kills that guy, and you're like, right, putting those two things together, there's so much here that there's like the allegory, I think, for like your working life. There's the thing of like, you made me laugh, and now you're going to do something absolutely horrific, which I think then is magnified. Like Scott, like you're saying, when he's in bed, then he's like, this is traumatic.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, that there's so much that you can sift through and kind of be like, I don't need to worry about this stuff. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I'm in work. Generally, people don't off each other in grotesque ways. So there's that I can't ignore. But do you know what I mean about that thing of like they're arguing and it's just tedious? You can see it in there. At one point, Scott just goes just so we can get out of the room for a bit. It's like it doesn't feel it's supposed to be important there, but actually this is just something that I'm supposed to do, and it's almost like the other stuff then. The stuff with the kid and just trying to make sense of everything is more important.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that the family drama is given as much attention and weight as this epic, universe affecting battle that he's going through as well.
Yeah,
and the combination of those two things is really interesting. That he doesn't. Not that he doesn't differentiate between the two things, but they're both equally important to him. Yeah,
work and home life balance. He kind of says, oh, he's at the shop one day or something, and the guy says, oh, where's your wife? He goes, oh, we was at the park, that's right. And he says, this woman, oh, she works and then I work and we swap over. And she's battling away in the fucking mines or something, and he's there in the park with the kid in the pushchair, and he's like, yeah, so it's a work-life balance, but his work is slaughtering people in an intergalactic war. And then, like, he has to go into that fight against that guy, and he loses badly because Bart's in the hospital or something, and it's like, okay, I'll take it.
I love that. That was one of my favourite bits where he's like on the phone to her and he says, you challenged Kanto to like a one-on-one, and if you lose, one of them gets to be the god or something.
They have to break,
and then she's like, I can't do it, and he's like, right, and they make it sound like this world-shattering thing that it could turn the tide of the war. Is just like going down the shop and buying nappies. Like, you said you're going to do this, I can't do that now. And he's like, I'm really annoyed, but I'm going to table this now because I don't have the strength in me for a fight.
It's just brilliant. It's just so many moments all the way through. And like we haven't even talked about the distortions. Like you said, there are moments where it changes reality, where you're constantly questioning reality, if it's real or not. And the distortion moments play into that on the artwork. And, he's constantly wearing different T-shirts that have got DC comic book character logos on. Right, there's one of them which I spotted this all the way through. So there's one moment where he's wearing a Superman T-shirt, so it's white and it's got the red logo on it, but it's the logo from the 90s when he was the Electric Superman.
Nice.
And then there's a distortion, and it changes to the blue Superman, because at one point they split, and you had Superman Red, Superman Blue from the 90s with that logo.
Shut the front door.
Yeah, and it's one panel. I was like,
because I noticed he had the white one on, but I just thought it was a different day.
I think it's on the same page. It just kind of like fritzes, and you go, oh, that's Superman Red, Superman Blue. I got it. I got that nod. But there's things like that all the way through. So good. So good.
It's amazing.
Have we run out of stuff to say?
No, I think we'll just sort of bask in the genius of it.
I'm actually flicking through the trade now just to try and find the bit where it switches to the white one. I thought when you were going to pick up the silence.
But there's cameos from people from DC as well. Like at the very end, I think it is, where he's doing an escaping from...
I noticed the Dio and Jim Lee.
Yes.
And hasn't it got the guy in it from Scott? You've seen John Wick 3, haven't you?
Oh, yes.
Steve, this isn't a spoiler. The only other thing I know this guy from is Brooklyn Nine-Nine. I know he's a comedian, but he's the
Jason something Kaza.
Yeah, he's one of the. I was like, I get that Dan DiDio might be in there, and there's probably other people from the editorial team I don't know. What's he doing there?
I don't know. I think he's a fan, or he's mentioned being a fan of DC Comics or something.
Really?
So he ended up in it, and then he was on like Seth Rogen talking about it, and showed the panel, and he's like, yeah, there I am, and of course the interviewer guy that he talks to is sort of like a cross between Seth Rogen and Conan in a way. It's really weird because he's got the weird kind of curly hair. But yeah, God, there's just little things like that. And then, of course, Tom and Mitch are in it themselves as two of the people in the background.
I did wonder if it was them because I only know what Tom King looks like.
Yeah, Mitch is the beardy guy in the same panel with that Jason guy. So
right,
there's tons of things like that all the way through. And you're like, brilliant. That's just brilliant.
Yeah,
I'm certain I miss so much stuff. I think I picked up on
page 196,
a reasonable amount of things.
What is it? 196.
Yes. Yeah.
Sorry, hold on. I've got it next to me. Wait.
Go ahead.
This is definitely brilliant podcasting here. Us all sitting here in silence.
Oh my! Wait.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it's the glitch. It's red, then it goes back to blue. Exactly. That is fucking brilliant.
How good is that?
That is so good. I didn't even notice that. There was loads of stuff that I didn't notice until the second time, though. Just kind of like character beats, like how when they go to assassinate Granny, how when she kind of gets the up on them, and kind of at first they're pretending and none of them know what's going to happen, and they both kind of regress.
Yeah.
So they're supposed to be these assassins, and then in front of kind of like a maternal figure, they kind of like regress a bit, and it was quite, again, it's that tender moment, but it's so kind of loaded with all these complicated emotions and kind of what they're going to do, and kind of that grotesque thing that they've been tasked with. And there's loads little like emotional beats, like when Scott is, I think it's after one of the wars. The context after one of those, he doesn't know how to turn the shower on. And she goes, "Did you leave it on?" And he's like, I don't even know if I actually switched it on. I'm just clean."
Is it on?
Later
Am I clean?
on, yeah. I said, you got that that attachment and that kind of humour thing to it. And then later on, when they have to debate whether or not to give Jacob the dark side, like he has a shower on his own and he just has this moment. And the page, that 9-panel page, and at the end, he's just in the fetal position.
Yeah.
And you're like, this is absolutely heartbreaking. Because I had, obviously, what he's going through and watching him kind of go through that is heartbreaking. But because you've given me that attachment of the humour to start with, it kind of hurts all the more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And you've got the war stuff going on all the time, and then there's like the birth, and all the Furies turn up. And they're just like in the waiting room.
Oh, yeah.
And they're all these maniacs are like, "I'm going to kill you, but we're here for Barda at the moment. So after this, we'll kill you. But is she okay?"
But isn't that so much like those kind of family gatherings where, like, underneath the surface, there's so much that people, there's so much history and all this stuff going on behind closed doors or whatever, but everyone knows you have to behave a certain way at certain functions and do certain things and those obligations.
Yeah.
I think, like we was talking about all the layers and stuff, but I think those are the things that kind of resonated the most with me. Like those the things that you suppress to get on. You're trying to make the best of things kind of all the time, and you don't necessarily know all the answers. You just got to kind of give it your best shot.
Yeah, it's definitely it's a really interesting sort of contrast between people behaving how they feel like they should and doing all this epic stuff in the background as well.
Yeah,
it's like the trial scene with the dip and stuff like that. It's well, we've got a bunch of people coming around, so we need to do catering, obviously.
And if you go to someone's house, you can't turn up empty-handed. So when they go to see Darkseid, despite the fact that they're taking their son there to leave him with him forever, "I brought a veggie tray," they just turns up. And it's like, oh, okay. And like Lilani's like shouting, and Barda responds in the same way, because that's how they greet each other, despite the circumstances of what they're about to do and what's about to happen. It's just like weddings and funerals. You act a certain way. You don't kick off. You don't do this, and that's what they do there as well.
I think the funniest thing for me, actually, first of all, let me ask a question, and I'll tell you the funniest thing for me.
Go on.
Funky Freshman, is that supposed to be Stanley?
Yes.
Right, cool. The funniest thing for me in this is the conversation that builds into Batman kills babies. And he even mentions it later on.
Yeah.
Because he says it to a person that has no context for it. Because Batman kills. Oh no, wait, hang on, this is the wrong audience for that.
Yeah.
It's just, and I know it's so clear, so much thought that went into it. But one of the brilliant things about it is, like anybody that's a genius, they just make it seem effortless the way they're doing it.
Yeah, completely.
It's so transformative and game changing the way that they did it. This is the closest thing that I've ever read to Watchmen that felt like it was, we're really doing something special with the formula now.
Yes.
And they just make it seem so easy. And like I said, I know I've said this loads of times before, but there's no pretension about it. It just is what it is, and they let it speak for itself, and it's just brilliant.
Yeah, because there's a lot of like complicated themes, but they don't make them complicated, and that you can pick up and focus on any strand you want. We talked about kind of the Orion stuff, and there's so much there that you could. It may not even be intentional, but there's stuff there about maybe like familial abuse and kind of that, the stuff that goes on, and all the stuff with Orion. But there's so much, every thread that you want to pick up and really, really focus on for your read. By the end of it, there's like a payoff. Because even like on that note, and I think the thing that everyone talks about and we did is the Darkseid is stuff. And like at the end, she says Orion wouldn't, and he says Orion isn't. Darkseid is, and then he goes Darkseid is. She goes, get it done. And you're like, this you're not making fun or making light of the rest of it, because sometimes that dark side is stuff is kind of a metaphor for struggling with like, you know, a mental illness, or maybe like overcoming depression, Scott, like you were saying. So it doesn't make fun of that, and it doesn't dilute how important that is for that character all the way through, but it means so much. There's such a good payoff to that, and at the same time it's like, if you can do that in a way that makes it light but also makes you think. It's like some of the best comedians, you know, they'll say something that really makes you think, and then they hit you up with a punchline, and you're like, that is brilliant, and I remember it all the more now.
And the panel format really feeds into that as well, because if you've got 9 panels on a page, you can't fit that many words in a panel, and actually it gives what the characters are saying. What they're saying is very simple. It's like very direct, because if you had, you know, one massive panel on a whole page, then people could say, like, you know, paragraphs worth of stuff, and you could fit that in easily. But because you've got this constraint of almost always having 9 panels on a page, what they say is very direct and blunt and to the point, and that gives it a lot of narrative strength, because they have to use words really economically within that format.
Yeah. It's weird, because this book stands by itself, and you decide whether it's in continuity or not, or where it sits or not. But at the same time, it's such a complete story and a big chunk of these characters' lives that it feels you've got a satisfying beginning, a middle, and an end. You know, one of the biggest complaints of like the main 2 Marvel and DC comic books is that they never really end, because they're all continuously, is it second arc that people say, or second act, that you can't get the death, you can't get the final end. But this kind of disproves that in a way, because you decide if it is in continuity or not, but equally there is a beginning and a middle and end of this story, and you get to the end and you're satisfied. It's like, if I never read another Mr. Miracle comic, I'd be happy with having read this one.
Oh my God, yeah.
But does it not even play with that it's kind of, you know, he towards the end he's almost choosing his reality.
Yes.
Where, you know, my recollection is it almost implies that he could go back to reality, but he would be on this never-ending treadmill of battle, which is normal comic continuity, right, in DC and Marvel, that it's this never-ending battle, and he's choosing his own reality. So it's almost like, again, playing with the fourth wall. It kind of feels like he's deliberately, within the context of this comic, taking himself out of comic continuity and just choosing this life.
See, interestingly, I think for me, the reality is that both exist. For him, the reality is that he has to do that other stuff. He's the High Father now, all that stuff. You know, there's the obligation there and all that, but also the same has got to be said for the home life stuff.
Yeah.
So the reality he chooses, for me, I think for me, it makes it equally more hopeful and also kind of redemptive for him, that his acceptance of whatever reality that any of us want to pick. But for me, the reality is that all of it's real. He's dealing with it. I think for me, it's why he kind of hugs Oberon at the end. And that was particularly kind of tear jerking, because at the start, he's like, oh, you know, Oberon, but like, he's dead. And this is the heartbreak of it. Like, he, as in Scott, made the decision to, like, do not resuscitate.
Yes.
So him kind of seeing him at the end and them hugging is him kind of going, right, I think I'm always, you know, all the way through it, he says, like, my problem is, like, sometimes I just don't know what's real. And it's him kind of accepting, like, these are my tics, right? These are kind of the illness that I have, whether you want to make it the anti-life equation, mental illness, depression, any of that stuff. He's like, right, that's always going to be there. I can't really do anything about that. But what I can stop doing, which is what that dark side is stuff, is I can stop trying to control that, and I can accept this other stuff. And the reality then is that it's all real, except for kind of the people that have visited me, which is what I imagine. And then for me, that it kind of makes it a bit more hopeful.
Yeah.
And I'm out.
I mean,
you both.
No, if we're sort of getting to the point of summarizing things, the thing that really blew my mind is we've talked about so many different things that they managed to accomplish, and the fact that within one story, they can hit all of the beats that we've talked about without labouring any of those points. It seems almost supernatural to me that they can do all of these things and generate all of this discussion and have all of these different facets to it. And just
still we could talk about it for another 2 hours.
Yeah. It's extraordinary. I don't think I've ever read anything like it.
You can see why I recommended it and said to you, it was right up there. I said to him, pick it up and read it, and I think you'll like it because it's so different. I mean, there are great comics. Oh, don't get me wrong. There are great comics coming out all of the time that are really, really good, and they're great stories. But this is something like, I mean, I read Dune by Frank Herbert every couple of years because I get something different from it every time, and there's so much in there to explore. And it's the same with this. And most comic books don't do that. They don't have that thing where I want to revisit it because there's more I can get from it a second, a third, a fourth, a 10th time.
Yeah, I definitely feel so. I'm a victim of how good it is because I sat down and read it in one sitting, and because I've sat down and read it in one sitting, non-stop, I know that I didn't give it the time that it deserves. So I definitely now need to sit down and read it again. Yeah. Like over the course of a month or something like that, and I'm sure I'll get more out of it. But
I respectfully are going to say you're full of shit there.
Go for it,
right?
Please do.
Because I think you have actually. I can't wait, but when I can read it all in one chunk, because I actually don't have to. I actually think, Scott, genuine, that you've benefited from being able to just consume it all in one, because it is 12 issues, but this is definitely all one story in the best way. And I think both times that I've read this, I've kind of read it so I read when I go to bed. So I'll read an issue before I fall asleep. So like every night I've read it, and I think if you read a little bit and then go away from it and come back, I think you kind of do it a disservice because it's almost hypnotic, because it's got all those like the revolutions and the way that it plays with the themes and then brings it back. I'm actually a little bit jealous that you did it all in one sitting, and I'm looking forward to do that. So, yeah.
Okay, so my counterpoint is that it deserves...
No, there's no counterpoint. There's me being right and you listening to me.
My counterpoint is that it deserves both.
Yeah, okay.
So you've had the advantage of reading it over a long period. I did it in one sitting. We now swap and get different things from it by doing that.
And then do another podcast.
Yeah.
Another hour.
Yeah.
Let's just rename the podcast the...
Mr. Miracle Podcast.
The Mr. Miracle Podcast. We'll all read it once a week.
Yeah.
And then just come back and say how great it is.
Yeah, like we'll do it, sequentially in one chunks, backwards and forwards, only odd numbers, only even numbers, and then we'll talk about it.
Yeah. I think that works.
There you go.
I think it's a good idea. Yeah, so as you can tell, there's a lot more we can talk about this. There's a lot in there still to do, and you can see why it's had such high accolades. It's weird. Some people would read it and think it's just a superhero comic, and it's like it's really got so little to do with superheroes that I can't really kind of stress that enough. That it does have very bright colours. I mean, the colours in the book, I don't even talk about them, are amazing. They're absolutely gorgeous, and their costumes are exceptionally bright and all this kind of stuff. But it's got nothing to do with people punching each other in the face.
Well, that's a really interesting combination. That they have these really, really bright, like 70s style costumes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that jars with the subject matter, which again is another facet to how brilliant it is.
I think I do. I know we're looking to kind of sign off now, but just on that point, I think there's points deliberately so. It really turns into like it gives you a little bit of. It's like, right, you know what? You're doing all this. You're dealing with all the layers, all the themes. It can be high, but we're just going to give you a little bit of old school comic book payoff here. And I think one of those is when they break in to that place on Apocalypse.
Yeah.
Although it's juxtaposed with them talking about like making space in the condo. And I think at the end as well, it's only a moment or a few moments, but like when they're with Darkseid and then they eventually overcome it, that's old school comics. That in the best way. It's like we'll give you a fix. Like, you kind of earned this. The comic's about other stuff, but we haven't forgotten about you. There's a bit of action there. I just like that,
and really good payoffs as well, and callbacks to things all the way through. I'm not going to spoil that bit, but that the payoff from earlier on, and just talking about Barda and all these things that tie in, and you go, oh yeah, of course,
yeah,
and the prophecy and all that stuff.
But I think like the whole book is like that. Like Scott, you mentioned earlier about like how they're doing all these things. I think when you read it, and I'm not even a writer, but you read it and you're just thinking, it's the same with Vision. Vision does exactly the same thing. It doesn't try to be anything more than it knows exactly what it is and knows exactly how to accomplish it. It doesn't, I suppose, like it's not doing all these other things, but you read it and you're like, of course, like this is the best way to tell a multi-layered, profound book about the human condition and how we deal and how we can't deal with stuff. And you're like, I can't believe people aren't knocking out these books a dime a dozen, but obviously, it takes a certain skill, and I think that's what Mr. Miracle shows us, is that there's only certain teams and certain people that can really pull that off.
They make it seem so easy, but it's clearly so hard.
My god!
Yeah.
Exceptionally good, and it's as you say, it's a rare comic. A handful of others you can talk about in the same way. In all the time I've been reading comics, that kind of shows you how special it is.
Oh, completely. I mean, I got onto this. Like, no one had kind of suggested it. I had a free on Comixology, and I think it's like half of the first book. And the reason I just hadn't paid any attention to it is because I didn't used to be a particular DC guy. I knew nothing. I knew who Jack Kirby was and kind of Mr. Miracle beforehand. Like, I recognised the character but knew nothing. Read the first half and I was like, I will be fucked if I'm not subscribing to this on Comixology and reading every issue the day it comes out.
Yeah.
And that's just on the first half of the first issue. And every single issue just adds more and more and more to it.
I really can't compare
it was just
to anything else I've read. Yeah.
No, I'm really joking, Scott. Go on.
Well, all I was saying was I just can't compare it to anything else I've ever read.
Yeah.
It's incredible. Yeah. So there's this and there's Watchmen. Off the top of my head, there will be others, but I can't think of any at the moment. But
I think I Kill Giants is up there for me.
Oh, controversial.
Why? Why is that controversial?
I've read it. I didn't like it.
Who are you?
Anything on controversy?
I have no words.
This is where Dan just disconnects.
He's got Dad gone. He's gone, Scott.
I think the close it's completely different, and it's more visceral, but kind of some of the things that it speaks to, not perhaps in the cleverest way, but is equally as effective at the end of it, is Scalp.
I never got to the end of that. I only read like the first trade or two, I think.
Oh, do you know what, Steve? Fuck you.
This is what we need, clickbait.
Just like, what, you just going to shit in my cereal every title I suggest?
Southern Bastards, there you go.
See, and that's Jason Aaron as well.
It is,
but Southern Bastards, it surprises me that if you read all of that.
I'm up to date with it in trade, yeah.
Yeah, so that is, I think, the devices and the loops it goes in and how it pulls the rug out from under you for characters that you hated, and then you kind of, against your will, sympathise with. Scalped is the progenitor of that.
Ah, right, okay.
So go back and read it, and then we'll do that on another podcast.
Yes.
No, go on, yeah, we'll call it Dan's podcast. But you two got to do all the work.
Right, okay. Fair dues.
Just for one episode, we'll call it that, and I'll send you a picture, and you can put it on the little tile for iTunes.
Anyway,
it'll be work safe.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for that. Jesus. God knows what I'd get otherwise. Right, there's so much more we can say about this book, but I think we've run out of time. So if you've not read Mr. Miracle, we've kind of spoilt a fair chunk of it, but there's so much
Yeah,
more to get out
if
of
people
it.
haven't read Mr. Miracle, we have destroyed the entire thing for them. Like,
There's a lot still to pick up, I think. It's worth reading, even if you've just heard us spoil it. You'll get more from your own reading, I think, and interpretations of it. So it's fantastic. So go out and read Mr. Miracle and tell us what you thought of it. And get in touch with us. Come onto the Facebook group. You can email us, grouchogeeks@gmail.com. Go onto the Geek Syndicate website and support this podcast and all of the others. Leave us an iTunes music review. And that's about it. Right. Thanks for coming on, Dan. We appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. Peace out.
Good night, Scott.
good night.